When we look at the difference between the walkable, human-centric design here in Europe versus the super-sized suburban sprawl with lakes of sprawling asphalt catering to the automobile in the United States, the divide can often seem insurmountable. But here's the thing. Germany didn't always used to be this way. In fact, our home city of Freiburg, known as Germany's green capital, and famously touting twice as many bicycles as cars, and over 40 kilometers of highly integrated streetcars powered solely on electricity generated by wind, solar, and water, was once just as car-centric as many American cities. The city center gave priority to cars, not people. And after decades of cutting service, in 1970, Freiburg's system had atrophied to just 14 kilometers, around 8.5 miles of dilapidated streetcar lines that were still in operation. And to be honest, even today, Germany is still a pretty car-centric culture. I mean, between Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, they were all top 10 companies by revenue in 2022. And we still have the infamous Autobahn, where you'll see long stretches for unlimited speed. But over time, the Germans found a way to embrace both. But it didn't happen overnight. It took a lot of planning and advocacy on behalf of people who wanted to see this change happen. So, let's take a look and see exactly how they got there. Okay, yeah, so objectively speaking, it's not hard to fall in love with Freiburg. Originating as a merchant settlement in 1120, our medieval German city is nestled at the foot of the Black Forest near the border triangle of Switzerland, France, and Germany. But with around 10% of the city's near 250,000 residents attending the prestigious Albert Ludwig Universität, our city is also one of Germany's youngest. Plus, current mayor Martin Horn was just shy of 34 when he was inaugurated at Town Hall in 2018. But don't let the colorful, half-timbered houses and cobblestone streets of Old Town fool you. A lot of those structures are actually pretty young, as they were faithfully and lovingly reconstructed after 2 separate World War II bombings. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's back up a bit. If you were to walk the streets of Freiburg at the end of the Second World War, it would have been wholly and devastatingly unrecognizable. I mentioned Freiburg was bombed not once, but twice, practically leveling much of the old city center and severely damaging the adjacent neighborhoods of Stühlinger and Herden. So in the 1950s, the overriding theme was still reconstruction. Although enormous reconstruction efforts were made, the city remained littered with rubble for several years. In fact, it wasn't until about 1950, 6 years after the bombing and 5 years after the end of the war, that the city's tram and bus network was fully operational again on all of its lines. But you see, like many cities in Germany after World War II, they were faced with a dilemma, and that was, what exactly do we want to look like moving forward? For some cities like Mannheim, this meant losing its medieval pre-war form and embracing the utility and predictability of building on a grid. But Freiburg took a different approach, choosing instead to largely reconstruct the city in the same medieval form. It's why our city still has the beautiful water-filled Bekles and the charm of the Fischerei, where, no, it wasn't for fish, but for the tanning of hides, and the cobblestone streets that meander and wind through town still exist today. But it's also important to think about this reconstruction as happening in tandem with the advancements of technology in other areas that were dramatically shaping urban environments around the globe, namely the automobile. Today, you'll still find the Bertholdsbrunnen in the heart of the pedestrian center of Old Town. There are so many people here, you can't even ride a bike down this street during peak hours. But if you were to go back in time, things used to look a lot different. In fact, there weren't just cars, but traffic lights at this intersection. The famed Münsterplatz that surrounds the stunning Gothic cathedral in the heart of the city, where today hosts one of the best farmers markets in the country. used to accommodate parking spaces for cars. So did the Alte Synagogplatz, the Kartoffelmarkt, and the Radekring. The famed Blue Bridge that spans the tracks over the central station was originally built for cars, not bikes. And the pedestrian zone in front of the futuristic, love it or hate it University Library, yeah, that looked a lot more like a highway than a connected campus. You actually used to have to cross a pedestrian bridge just to access it and not impede the traffic below. But despite the reconstruction in the city center, most of Freiburg's post-war population growth was accommodated in new settlements at the fringe of the existing city. Indeed, similar to many American cities, Freiburg's land use plan of 1955 endorsed geographic expansion of the city based on automobile transport. In essence, suburban sprawl. Old streetcar lines were abandoned and service was cut back since buses and the automobile were deemed the modes of transportation of the future. So unsurprisingly, during this time period, car ownership and use increased, and so did air pollution, traffic fatalities, and traffic congestion. But the 1970s really is the decade that is most credited with giving Freiburg its sustainability and green-centric flair that we know and love today. In the 1970s, oil price shocks cast nuclear power as a smart option for domestically supplying energy needs for both West German consumers and industry. Demand for electricity was projected to grow by 7% annually, and the state's solution was the construction of 8 nuclear power plants by 1990. But in an interesting twist of fate, anti-nuclear sentiment here in conservative southwestern Germany showcased the ultimate power of not in my backyard protesting, but for environmental good. You see, at the beginning of 1973, the government agreed to sell land to Baden-Württemberg AG, a nuclear utility company that was proposing to build a nuclear power plant in Wiel, a small village just outside of Freiburg in the wine-growing Kaiserstuhl region along the Rhine River. But anti-nuclear activists, environmentalists, and local residents reacted with a 6-kilometer-long procession to Wiel in 1974. And in June of that year, after citizens felt that a required public hearing was biased, since the chairman of the hearings was a partial owner of the Baden-Württemberg AG utility company, they left the hearing in protest, carrying a coffin with the following inscription: "The death of democracy." So if they weren't going to be heard in formal hearings and town halls, they were gonna need to get creative with their protesting. And yeah, they did. In February 1975, it's estimated that somewhere near 30,000 people demonstrated and then occupied the construction site. The massive 10-month-long occupation attracted international attention and support from numerous anti-nuclear activists in Europe. The thousands occupying the site used slogans, banners, posters, and costumes to show their opposition. Activists also founded a popular university at Wiel, with more than 60 courses, lectures, and discussions on environmental protection, democracy, and the right to protest. And in the end, by 1977, the district court decided to not move forward with the power plant. So they got their way. But I think what's really almost more interesting for me is just how much this demonstrates the power of people coming together to collectively have their voice heard. Even people who you wouldn't naturally think would have come together in the first place. This protest forged an unlikely alliance of leftist students, Catholic and Protestant church leaders, the Conservative Party, and local farmers. Plus, highly respected civic leaders were at the center of the local opposition to the state government's plan. And their role in the protests legitimized environmental protection and alternative development ideas for the local population. And as a result of these events, a strong autonomous sense and a broad ecologically oriented spectrum developed in the city. And Freiburg became a stronghold for the newly founded Green Party, not just scientifically and economically, But Freiburg developed a climate that gave the city a leading role as an environmental city. So while some 30,000 people were protesting in Wiel, things were actually changing quite dramatically in Freiburg on the transportation front. For starters, Freiburg's first integrated transport plan of 1969 had inadvertently laid the foundation for changes to come. Although still focusing on car use, the plan recommended for preserving and potentially expanding the streetcar network, a suggestion the city council followed in 1972. But then the city decided to do something pretty radical for the time. Like most cities in Europe, Old Town, Altstadt, the city center, was by and large the center of commercial business. It's where there are large department stores. The university's located there. The train station's located there. And if you want to go do major shopping, that's where you went. And honestly, it's where you still go today. But then the citizens looked at this super busy, popular area and said, what if we just ban cars? Seriously. And don't get me wrong, initially, local businesses opposed this idea. But the city administration, citizen groups, and local business owners were able to reach a consensus of banning cars from downtown, and instead providing automobile parking garages along the ring road at the fringes of the car-free zone. So in the early 1970s, Freiburg not only implemented its first integrated bicycling network plan, but designed a new car-free pedestrian zone in the center of Old Town, the largest pedestrian zone in all of Germany at the time. And things really started to kind of snowball from there, influencing both land use planning and transportation plans in neighborhoods across the city. In 1979, Freiburg's second integrated transport plan focused on environmental protection and sustainable development. The new plan favored public transport, walking and cycling over the automobile, and called for the integration of transport and land use planning. And priorities for that land use policy shifted accordingly. The Land Use Plan of 1981 prescribed that new development was to be concentrated along public transport corridors, especially the city's expanding light rail system, whose first new line opened in 1983. Essentially, if you think of it from an urban planner perspective, sometimes you have to use the carrot or the stick method. And in this case, they chose to use the carrot, which was to say that if you want to build anything new, any new development has to happen along the public transit system corridor, particularly along that new light rail system. But in existing neighborhoods, they still simultaneously use the stick to disincentivize car use. During the 1980s, the city council, encouraged by neighborhood associations, voted to traffic calm all residential neighborhoods to 30 kilometers per hour to discourage through traffic in residential areas. Plus, the cost of driving was further increased by parking management schemes which limited long-term parking and charged motorists higher parking fees. The reauthorization of Freiburg's transport plan in 1989 re-emphasized the explicit goal of limiting car travel and increasing use of green modes, such as walking, cycling, and public transport. Now at this point, I feel like banning cars from the city center, expanding their light rail system, and incentivizing people to take public transit or their bicycle over the car would have already landed Freiburg pretty great international acclaim. But one of the things that I personally love about the culture here in Freiburg is that there really does seem to be a sentiment amongst the citizens here to say, yeah, that's good, but let's keep going. And the next phase for Freiburg saw it not just doing better, but becoming the best in the world. From 1993 to 2009, Freiburg redeveloped two inner suburban neighborhoods around newly extended streetcar lines: Riesefeld, which was built on the site of a former sewage farm, and Vauban, which was built on the grounds of an abandoned French military base. And they essentially were trying to solve a dilemma that plagues a lot of metro communities in the US. That's, how do we create a new settlement for 5,000 inhabitants that both attracts young families while simultaneously discourages them from moving into the suburbs? Well, In 1993, the residents of Vauban founded a non-profit organization, Forum Vauban, which worked together with the city's administration to realize a dream. Let's use sustainable, low-energy construction methods, mixing land uses, preserving old trees, and making large parts of the new development completely car-free. And bear in mind, this was 30 years ago, before many of these types of policies were prevalent or popular, which meant that they had to overcome some pretty significant obstacles along the way. And a big one relative to the car was parking. Similar to most local American zoning codes, the state of Baden-Württemberg requires minimum parking standards for new developments. But after long negotiations, Vauban was granted a waiver for minimum parking requirements, provided that enough green space was preserved for potential future construction. Building permits in Vauban are therefore issued for residential units without parking spots. Residents who decide to own a car can purchase a parking spot in one of the garages at the edge of the development for the equivalent of about $25,000. Residents who wish to live car-free simply pay a one-time fee of $5,000 to preserve an open space on the edge of the development, in lieu of a parking spot. And this arrangement has actually proven successful. A recent survey showed that there are only 150 cars per 1,000 inhabitants of Vauban, compared to the roughly 420 for the city of Freiburg and over 560 for Germany. But before I wrap up this video, I want to head back to Old Town and talk about a more recent development that's actually happened within the city since I've lived here. Anticipating a large growth in automobile transportation, the city took steps in the 1970s that drastically changed the area around the outside of Old Town, particularly near the Schwabentor. Expanding this small alley into a 4-lane ring road meant not only holding back an entire mountain of earth, but also tearing down historic buildings that weren't actually lost during the war. Prior to 1800, locals blasted caverns into the side of Schlossberg to help keep their beer cool, and beer gardens popped up just outside their entrance to serve thirsty customers. And whereas prior, citizens and tourists alike could easily walk from the Münstermarkt to one of those beer gardens in the forest overlooking the city planners instead tore them out to install this concrete mess, which funnels cars in and out of the parking garage. And they even had to install this clunky bridge that still exists today to get pedestrians over the traffic and to the paths that lead to the only beer garden left in existence on the Schlossberg. But the ring road isn't just a major transportation path for the car. Because of the surrounding geography, namely the Schlossberg, the Dreisam, and the train tracks, if you want to get from Viera to Herdern or beyond by bicycle, you also have to navigate it alongside cars. And in some areas, this was actually really treacherous. You were essentially riding a bicycle on a sidewalk path alongside pedestrians. And if you were somebody who was pulling a kid trailer, it was uncomfortably tight. And this is all next to a road where cars are whizzing past you at 50 kilometers an hour. It really wasn't safe. So enter into the conversation Fuß- und Radentscheid Freiburg, a nonpartisan alliance which advocates for pedestrian and cycling infrastructure. And these citizens had a pretty radical idea. Let's let people reclaim the ring road. On April 26, 2020, they reclaimed a piece of the city once lost to them in the name of the automobile. And with thousands of bicycles, longboards, inline skates, and feet, they put a smile on the face of thousands of people by completely shutting down one lane of the Schlossberg Ring. And guys, it worked. Today, the outer lane of the Schlossberg Ring, from the Schwabentor to the Stadtgarten, is reserved for bicyclists. Instead of being crammed together on a tight sidewalk each day, thousands of commuters and families, including Jonathan, use this lane to safely navigate their city. As populations grow, we have to be innovative. We have to find clever and smart ways to integrate green technology and to make sustainable travel options not just viable, but preferred. And yeah, speaking candidly here as an American, I get it. I too sometimes look at cities in Europe, specifically Freiburg, and then I think back to just the sprawling suburbia that we see in the States, and it does seem like there's just this huge divide between European and American cities. But I think there's a lesson here. Freiburg too once had planning and transportation policies that looked a lot like the States. And although it took a lot of time to get there, change is possible. Like I said before, there really is a sentiment in the city where people look around and they say, yeah, that's good, but let's keep going. And it makes me so excited to see what kind of changes are going to happen 20, 30 years from now in a city that already, by my standards, seems to do quite well in the green cycling infrastructure category. So maybe that's the lesson. Maybe we're not all that different. We just have to learn to advocate for it and get political leadership and funding behind it. So I think that's probably a good place to wrap up this video and ask you guys down in the comment section. What would you like to see in your communities to make them more sustainable, more cycling friendly, more pedestrian friendly, and more specifically, what do you think has to happen in order to get there? Let me know down in the comment section below. And as always, if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And for more content from the Black Forest family, hit that subscribe button. So, until next time, tschüss!